I'm Faye, and I was 33 the night my dad put my grandpa out in a storm. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of West Texas rain that comes sideways and stays for hours. My phone buzzed once, a neighbor I barely knew. "Your granddad's sitting on the porch in this," she wrote, bags and all. I was 40 minutes away. I drove it in 30. 8 months earlier, my grandpa had sold his ranch for $1.2 million and handed every cent to my father. He'd asked for one thing in return. 3 words. Take care of me. What the will reading revealed 3 months later, after he was gone, after the lawyer opened a folder none of us expected, is the part nobody in that room ever saw coming, including me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, quiet stories about family, money, and the people who finally stop apologizing. If a story has ever made you sit very still in your car after you parked, you're in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Now. That night when I got him into the truck, he was clutching one thing against his chest: an old weather radio. Let me back up 8 months, because the money came first, and the money explains everything. My grandpa, Harold Anderson, was 80 years old when he sold the ranch. He'd worked that land for 51 years. When the offer came, $1.2 million for the surface, clean. He took it. Then he did something I still don't fully understand. He gave all of it to my dad. Not a trust. Not a check with conditions. He wired the whole sum into Roy Anderson's checking account on a Friday afternoon. I was there for the handoff, sitting at my parents' kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold. My dad kept saying the same thing. "Dad, you don't have to do this." And my grandpa, who never wasted a word in his life, looked at him across the table and said it plain. "Take care of me." That was the whole arrangement. A handshake and 3 words. My mother, Linda, had her arms folded the entire time, nodding like she'd negotiated it. I remember thinking it was strange that a man that careful would hand over everything on a promise. So I asked him, "Grandpa, why didn't you put it in writing?" He smiled at me, the slow one he saved for when he thought you were almost asking the right question. "Some things you write down, Faye," he said. "Some things you find out." I didn't know what that meant. I figured it was old man talk, the kind that sounds like wisdom and means he didn't want to deal with a lawyer. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about almost everything that year. He folded his hands over that weather radio on the table and didn't say anything else. The check cleared by Monday. You need to know who my grandpa was, or none of the rest will land. Harold Anderson was the cheapest rich-feeling poor man in the state of Texas. He patched his work boots with shoe goo until the soles were more glue than leather. He drank his coffee from one chipped blue enamel mug, the same one for as long as I'd been alive, and he washed it by hand every single time. When the truck's AC died, he rolled the windows down for 3 summers rather than pay to fix it. We all thought the ranch was the whole of him. That $1.2 million was Harold's entire life converted to cash. He never corrected us, but every so often he'd say a thing that didn't fit the man we thought we knew. The afternoon after the wire cleared, I drove him back out to the empty ranch so he could walk the fence line one last time. He stopped at the cattle gate and looked out at the flat brown nothing of it. "People think it's just dirt," he said. "The land was never just dirt." I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. He just took out a small brass key on a worn leather cord, the one he wore under his shirt, and turned it over in his fingers like a worry stone. I was 33 and freshly humbled. My own startup, an ag-tech soil sensor company I'd poured 4 years and every dollar into, had folded the spring before. I was doing contract coding out of a 1-bedroom apartment and pretending I had a plan. So when my grandpa talked about dirt that wasn't just dirt, I half listened. The way you do when you're busy losing at your own life. He slid the key back under his collar. We drove home in the heat with the windows down. That brass key became a small game between us. He wore it everywhere, even to the dinner table, and once I asked him straight what it opened. He pinched it through his shirt and grinned. "Key still opens something worth opening," he said. "That's all I'll tell a girl who lost a whole company. Coming from anyone else, it would have stung. From him, it was almost tender. Harold's way of saying he hadn't written me off, even if I had. He moved into my parents' house in town that week. Roy gave him the back bedroom that used to be my brother Dale's. For about a month, it looked fine from the outside. Then the phone calls started. My mother would call me, her voice arranged into worry. "Faye, has your grandfather said anything to you? About us? About the house?" I'd say no, because he hadn't. Linda would go quiet for a second too long. "Well," she'd say, "he gets confused. We just want to manage things properly." I didn't have a word for it then. I do now. It's the oldest move in elder abuse. You isolate the money conversation, you keep the responsible relative in the dark, and you call it managing. My mother was very good at it. She'd grown up with nothing and married into the Andersons expecting more than Harold's frugality ever gave her. 30 years of feeling house poor in a family that owned land. When the 1.2 million landed, something in her decided it was finally, at long last, owed. I didn't see the danger in those phone calls. I thought my parents were tired. I thought caring for an old man was just hard. I told myself that for weeks, right up until the night the bags went out on the porch in the rain. So now we're back at that Tuesday in March. The rain. The neighbor's text. I left a video call mid-sentence, grabbed my keys, and drove the 40 minutes to my parents' house with the wipers losing the fight the whole way. When I pulled up, my grandpa was sitting on the front steps under the porch light, 2 canvas bags beside him, already soaked through. That same weather radio held against his chest like a child holds a stuffed animal, the antenna up, the little speaker crackling out a storm advisory nobody needed because the storm was right there. The porch light was on. The house lights were off. They'd put him out and gone to bed. I came up the walk and my father opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been waiting to explain himself. "Faye, it's not what it looks like," Roy said. "There's a wait list at Sage Meadows. We're just—" My mother appeared behind him in her robe. "We took him to the curb so the transport van could find him easy," she said. "In the morning. In a thunderstorm." At 10 p.m. I asked them how long he'd been outside. Roy looked at the floor. Linda lifted her chin. "He's not our problem anymore," she said. "We did our part." "There's no van," I said. "There's no Sage Meadows. There's just an 80-year-old man in the rain." Nobody answered me, so I stopped talking to them. I went back down the steps, crouched in front of my grandpa, and put my hand on the cold radio. "Hey," I said, "let's get you out of here." He looked at me, and for a man who'd been confused all month according to my mother, his eyes were perfectly clear. "Take care of me," he said. Quiet. Not a plea. More like he was handing something off. I got his bags. I got him into the truck. As I buckled him in, the porch light went off behind us. We drove away from that house in the dark, the radio still crackling between us. My apartment was 800 square feet and not built for 2. I gave my grandpa the bedroom and took the pull-out couch. That first night, I peeled him out of wet clothes, got him into one of my old company t-shirts, and set him up with extra blankets while the radiator clanked. He didn't complain. Harold never complained. He sat on the edge of my bed at midnight, drying that ridiculous radio with a dish towel, checking that it still worked. It still worked. By the second day, I'd reorganized my entire life around him. I made a spreadsheet. I'm a software engineer. Spreadsheets are how I love people. With his medications, his blood pressure schedule, his cardiology appointment, the foods that didn't fight his stomach. I moved my contract calls to early mornings so my afternoons were his. I told myself it was temporary, just until things calmed down, just until my parents came to their senses. They didn't call. My brother did. Dale's text came in on the 3rd day. "Don't make this a thing, Faye," it read. "Mom and Dad had reasons. He's a lot to handle." I stared at it for a while. He's a lot to handle. The man weighed 150 pounds and asked for nothing. I didn't write back. I just looked over at the closed bedroom door, at the line of light underneath it, and listened to the soft static of the radio he kept on low all night so the apartment wouldn't be so quiet. I had no idea how I'd afford the cardiologist on contract income. I had no idea how long temporary was going to be. What I knew was simpler than a plan. I was not sending him back. Whatever it cost, in money or sleep or my own stalled-out life, I was not sending him back. Here's the thing about people who do an ugly thing in private. They work twice as hard at looking good in public. Within a week, my mother had a story, and she told it to everyone. She told it at church. She told my aunts on the phone. She told the cousins on the group thread I was somehow still on. We did everything for Harold, she'd say. We took him in. We cared for him. And Faye swooped in and took him to score points. We're heartbroken. My Aunt Carol called me, her voice careful. Honey, she said, your mother's worried sick. Why'd you take him without telling them? I told her the truth. The porch, the rain, the bags. There was a silence on the line, and then Carol said the thing that told me which way the family was going to lean. Well, you know your mother exaggerates, but she wouldn't just put him out. She's not like that. People believe the version that lets them keep loving who they already love. I understood that. I even forgave it. But it meant I was on my own. My mother had a 30-year head start on being the sympathetic one, and I'd just lost a company and moved a sick old man into a studio apartment. On paper, I looked like the unstable one. You always did love playing the martyr, Faye, my mother said, the one time she called that month, to ask whether Grandpa had mentioned the ranch money. Not how he was. Whether he'd mentioned the money. I told her he was sleeping and hung up. Then I sat on my pull-out couch and did the math on a cardiology copay I couldn't cover, and I laughed, because the alternative was the other thing, and I'd promised myself I wasn't going to do the other thing in front of him. I broke down and called my parents once. Not for me. For him. His blood pressure medication had jumped to $240 after the cardiologist adjusted the dose, and I'd just had a contract fall through. So I swallowed every ounce of pride I had left and called the people sitting on $1.2 million to ask them to split a prescription for the man that money was supposed to be for. My mother answered on the fourth ring. I explained it flat, no drama, just numbers. There was a pause. Then she said it, in a tone so reasonable it took me a second to feel the knife. We took care of him, Faye. The check cleared. I asked her what that meant. It means we did our part, she said. We took the responsibility. We got the money. It's done. He's your project now. He's your project now. As though a person were a side gig I'd picked up. I didn't argue. Arguing with my mother was like wrestling smoke. You ended up exhausted and dirty and holding nothing. I just said okay and hung up and stood in my kitchen for a minute, and that's when it finally clicked. The whole shape of it. To my parents, that $1.2 million wasn't a trust. It wasn't even really payment. It was a buyout. They'd cashed a check and considered their father paid off. Settled. Closed. The promise was a receipt to them. Take care of me had been answered by the check cleared, and in their ledger the books were balanced. I went and looked in on my grandpa. He was awake, propped up, the radio murmuring. You okay, kid? He asked, because somehow he was the one checking on me. Never better, I said. He didn't believe me, but he let me have it. What I didn't expect was that he'd start trying to fix my life while I was busy fixing his. It started small. He'd watch me hunch over my laptop at the kitchen table, debugging somebody else's inventory app for $90 an hour, and he'd ask what happened to my own thing. My own thing was a soil moisture sensor network. Cheap probes, a little weather model, software that told a farmer when to irrigate and when to wait out a coming rain. I'd built a real product. I'd just run out of money before the market noticed. It died, I told him. Too expensive to make. Nobody'd buy it for the price. He picked up his chipped blue mug, the one I'd packed from the ranch kitchen without asking, and turned it in his hands. Good tools earn their keep, he said. So make a cheaper tool. I told him it wasn't that simple. He said most things people call complicated are just expensive, and most expensive things are somebody refusing to start over. Then he started asking questions. Real ones. How does the probe know it's wet? What's the most fragile part? Why does a rain sensor cost more than the rain? By the end of the week, we had a notebook full of his blocky pencil sketches. A man who'd read the sky for 51 years, redesigning my hardware around the one instrument he trusted. That beat-up weather radio. "We can pull the front off a storm cell off the public band," he said, tapping it. "Why are you paying for satellite data?" He was right. I'd been paying for satellite data. That was the first afternoon in a year I'd worked on my own idea instead of someone else's bug, and I noticed, around 4 o'clock, that I'd forgotten to be sad. He noticed too. He didn't say anything. He just refilled the mug. People ask me how I afforded all of it on contract work. The honest answer is, I didn't. Not really. I sold my car and bought a cheaper one. I just refused to send him back. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your budget for someone who'd have done the same for you without keeping score, comment, "I see you," and subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. Because it does not end where you think. We rebuilt the prototype around his radio in the second month. And the night it finally worked, he told me about the storms. The probe was talking to the weather band now, pulling pressure data off the same public frequency he'd listened to since before I was born, and when the little screen flashed its first correct rain warning, he laughed out loud, a sound I'd heard maybe 4 times in my life. Then he got quiet in the good way, and he started telling me about the ranch. Not the dirt. What was under it. He told me about the wells that came in dry and the one that didn't. He told me about a man in a suit who'd shown up in 1979 and offered to lease the mineral rights, and how everyone in town said Harold was a fool to sign because nothing was down there. He told me he kept the radio on every storm season for 51 years because weather was the only honest thing on the ranch, the one thing that couldn't lie to you or change its mind. I asked what happened with the 1979 man. He just smiled and said, "The land was never just dirt, Faye. Same line as the empty fence." This time it sounded less like wisdom and more like a fact he was deciding whether to tell me. He didn't tell me. He set the radio on the nightstand, and he said something that should have caught my attention more than it did. "I need you to drive me somewhere next week," he said. "There's a person I've put off seeing too long." I asked who. He said, "Somebody who keeps things in writing." And then he turned out the light, and the radio crackled low into the dark, and I lay on my pull-out couch wondering who keeps things in writing. He started getting tired the 3rd month, in the way that doesn't announce itself. He slept later. He'd nod off mid-sketch, pencil still in his hand. The chipped blue mug would sit on the table going cold, half full, and that more than anything scared me. Because Harold Anderson had never in his life let a cup of coffee go to waste. I made his appointments closer together and told myself the cardiologist would have a tweak, another dose, another fix. I picked up 2 more contracts to cover the visits and ran on 5 hours of sleep, and I got short with a client, and I lost that contract too, and I told no one because there was no one to tell. That was the trap I was in, the one I didn't see from the inside. I'd built my whole self around being the one who handles it, and handling it alone had become its own kind of pride. I wouldn't ask my aunts. I wouldn't ask Dale. I wouldn't have asked my own reflection for a glass of water. So I just absorbed it, all of it, until my hands shook a little in the mornings. One afternoon, my grandpa watched me count his pills into the daily organizer with my jaw set tight, and he reached over and stopped my hand. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you carry it so nobody sees the carrying." I told him I was fine. He gave me that slow smile. "So am I," he said, which we both knew was a lie, and somehow that made it easier, 2 liars at a kitchen table refusing to be sad together. That night he asked again about the appointment. "Next week," I promised. He nodded and closed his eyes, and his breathing went slow and even, and I sat up watching the line of light under nothing, listening to him sleep. I found it while I was sorting his medications. He'd asked me to refill his pill organizer from the bag of bottles he kept in the nightstand drawer, and when I pulled the bag out, something slid out with it and landed on the floor. A sealed envelope, the heavy cream kind, and a small printed appointment card, paper clipped to the front. The envelope had a name and address embossed in the corner. Margaret Ellison, attorney at law, estate, and trust. The card had a date and a time, 11 days out, and below it, in handwriting that wasn't my grandfather's, a note. Bring the key. I sat back on my heels and held it. I didn't open it. I want you to understand that, because I've thought about it 100 times since. The man had given away $1.2 million and gotten thrown out in the rain, and his granddaughter, broke and exhausted, found a sealed envelope from an estate attorney in his nightstand and did not open it. It didn't even tempt me. Some doors a person opens on his own. I clipped the card back on and slid the envelope into the drawer exactly where it had been, and when I went to put the bag away, I saw him watching me from the bed. He'd been awake the whole time. He looked at the drawer, then at me, and his hand went up to his collar and closed around the brass key on its leather cord, the way you'd hold a thing you were finally about to use. "You'll drive me Thursday," he said. It wasn't a question. I said I would. I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't ask what the key opened. I just memorized the date. The 11th day, 11 a.m., Margaret Ellison. And I held it in the back of my mind like a stone in a pocket for everything that came after. Thursday, I drove him into town to a low brick office building with Margaret Ellison's name on a brass plate by the door. He'd dressed for it, a pressed shirt, his good boots, the patched ones left at home. He took the brass key off from around his neck in the truck and held it in his fist the whole walk in. I offered to come back for him. He said sit, so I sat in the waiting room with a styrofoam cup of bad coffee and watched the minute hand. 53 minutes. When the door opened, he came out steadier than he'd gone in, the way a man walks when he's set something down he'd been carrying a long time. The attorney walked him out, Margaret Ellison, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up into iron gray hair, a handshake like she meant it. She looked at me a beat longer than a stranger should. "You're Faye," she said. It wasn't a guess. I said I was. She nodded once, like that confirmed something, and told my grandfather she'd take care of the rest. In the truck, he buckled himself in and looked out the windshield at the parking lot for a long moment. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago," he said. I asked him what. He turned the brass key over in his fingers, then slipped it back under his collar. "You'll find out," he said. Same as always. That was Harold's whole theology in 3 words. You'll find out. I started the engine. I wanted to push, to ask what the envelope said, what the key opened, what he'd fixed, and why now. But he had his eyes closed and his face tipped toward the sun coming through the glass, and he looked, for the first time in months, like a man at peace. So I let him have the quiet, and I drove us home. Dale showed up the next weekend. My brother is 38 and underwater. A house flip in Odessa that went wrong, a second mortgage, a tone of voice that's always halfway to asking for something. He brought a gas station bouquet and a smile, and the transparent intentions of a man who's done the arithmetic on a dying relative. He sat with Grandpa for 10 minutes, mostly talking about himself, then found me in the kitchen. "So how's he doing?" "Really," Dale said, and I knew really meant financially. I said he's tired. Dale lowered his voice. "Listen, somebody should have power of attorney. For his protection. I think it should be family. Me and Mom and Dad. Keep it simple. Keep it simple." I told him my grandfather managed himself just fine. Dale's smile thinned. "Faye, there's stuff you don't know about. He's got assets nobody's tracking, and if he goes without it sorted, it's a mess for everybody." I asked what assets. He looked at me like he'd said too much, then waved it off. "The ranch money," he said. "Mom and Dad's money." But it caught. Assets nobody's tracking, plural, like there was more than the 1.2 million. I filed it next to the stone already in my pocket. After Dale left, I checked on Grandpa. He'd heard every word through the thin wall, of course. "Your brother wants my signature," he said. I told him nobody was getting his signature he didn't want to give. He chuckled, low and dry. "Oh, They'll get a signature, he said. Just not the one they're after. I asked what that meant. He patted the radio on the nightstand like an old dog. Turn this up, would you? He said. There's weather coming. And there was. 3 days out on the long-range band, the first spring storms rolling up out of the Gulf, though by the time they hit, everything had already changed. The last fully good night we had was a Sunday. He felt strong, ate a real dinner, sat up at the kitchen table while I soldered a new probe lead. The radio played a baseball game low. He watched my hands work for a while, and then he said the thing I've kept folded up and carried ever since. You never once asked me what was in it for you, he said. I looked up. He was turning his mug slowly on the table. Your parents, the day of the wire, your brother last weekend. First question out of all of them was always what's in it for me. You've had me 3 months. You sold your car. You haven't asked once. I told him there was nothing to ask about. He shook his head slowly. That's the whole thing, Faye, he said. That's the entire thing. I didn't know what to say, so I said the true thing, the small one. I didn't take you in for a reason. I took you in because it was you. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said it, and he flipped my own grandfather's 3 words around so they pointed back at me. You did take care of me, he said. Past tense, like he was closing a book he'd been reading a long time. I made some joke about how the job wasn't done yet. Eat your vegetables. And he let me. But something had settled in him. A stillness I mistook for peace, and only later understood was a man arriving somewhere. He went to bed early. I tucked the blanket and turned the radio down. Not off, the way he liked. At the door he said, "Good night, kid." I said, "Good night, Grandpa." Those were the last ordinary words we traded. I didn't know that. He might have. I'm going to tell you what the lawyer read out loud, and I promise it's worth the wait. But first, if you have an aging parent or grandparent and you've never once put your care arrangement in writing, take this as your sign. A handshake is not a plan. A cleared check is not a contract. Comment noted if you needed to hear that today. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because this is where it turns. He didn't wake up on a Wednesday morning. I knew before I opened the bedroom door, the way you know a house is empty the second you step in. He'd gone in his sleep, sometime in the small hours, with the radio still murmuring on the nightstand and the chipped blue mug rinsed and upside down on the drying rack where he'd left it the night before. He'd washed his own mug, 80 years old, 3 months from a porch in a thunderstorm, and the last thing he did was rinse his cup so I wouldn't have to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The radio kept talking. A calm voice reading out a marine forecast for a coast 400 miles away, for boats neither of us would ever own. At some point I reached over and turned it off, and the apartment got so quiet I couldn't stand it, so I turned it back on. Then I did the things you do. I called the doctor. I called the funeral home. And then, because they were his family and it was the decent thing even when they hadn't earned decency, I called my parents. My mother picked up. "Mom," I said, "Grandpa passed last night." There was a silence on the line. And then, I will hear this until I die, the first thing out of my mother's mouth was not a sound of grief. It was a question, quick and bright and reaching. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Faye. Has anyone called the lawyer? Has anyone called the lawyer?" Her father was 4 hours cold, and her first instinct was the estate. I told her I had to go and hung up. The radio crackled. I made myself a cup of coffee in his mug, and I let it go cold, just to know how it felt. The funeral was where my mother gave the performance of her life. She wore charcoal gray and wept on cue at the front of the chapel, dabbing under her sunglasses, accepting the arm of every cousin who came to comfort her. "We took such good care of him," she told the receiving line, again and again, until the line itself believed it. "We did everything we could. At the end, he just wanted to be with family." People nodded. People held her hands. My Aunt Carol shot me a look across the room that said, "See, she's devastated. How could you have thought?" I stood off to the side in a black dress I'd bought for a startup pitch I never gave, and I said nothing, because there is no winning a grief contest against a woman willing to cry at her own crime. Dale gave a eulogy about the value of hard work that was somehow mostly about Dale. My father didn't speak. Roy sat in the front pew with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor, and twice I saw him glance at the casket and then look away fast, like it hurt to be seen looking. That was the first crack I noticed in him. I tucked it away too. After the service, while the crowd thinned, a woman in iron gray hair came up the aisle toward me, Margaret Ellison, in a navy suit, a leather folder under her arm. She offered her condolences, plain and real, and then she handed me a card with a date and time on the back. "The reading of the will," she said. 10 days out. My office. She held my eyes. "Your grandfather asked that everyone be in the room," she said. Everyone. And then she did the strangest thing. She glanced once at my mother across the chapel, looked back at me, and nodded. A small, private nod, the kind that means I know something you don't yet. The 10 days before the reading were their own slow weather. My mother's story hardened into family fact. Faye took advantage of a confused old man. Faye isolated him from his loving son. Faye is after the estate. The irony of that last one, coming from the woman whose first question over her father's body was about the lawyer, could have powered a small city. The cousins took sides. Aunt Carol called to suggest, gently, that maybe I should let the family handle the will stuff and not make a scene. A scene? I'd made a casserole every night for 3 months and lost 2 contracts and a car. My mother cried at a chapel, and that was grief. I refused to argue, not because I was a saint. I wanted to scream the truth into the group thread until my throat gave out. I refused because I'd watched my whole family spend 8 months proving that the loudest version wins, and I had decided I was not going to fight on their field. Let them talk. The talk wasn't the trial. The talk was just talk. I'm not going to argue about a man I actually showed up for, I told Carol, and I hung up before she could make it a scene about how I'd made it a scene. In the quiet apartment, I kept his radio on. I kept his mug on the windowsill. And I kept the brass key. Because 3 days after the funeral, sorting the last of his things into a donation bag, I'd found it. Not on its leather cord around his neck, where it had lived for months. Lying loose in the nightstand drawer, on top of a folded slip of paper, in his blocky pencil hand. "Give this to Margaret," it said. So I would. 10 days felt like a year. The storm on the long-range band kept building. The morning of the reading, I did something that probably sounds strange. I put his weather radio on the passenger seat of the truck and buckled it in. I know how that reads. I'm an engineer. I don't believe a radio carries a soul. But I'd driven him to the lawyers once already with that thing crackling between us, and I wasn't about to do the last drive with the seat empty. So the radio rode shotgun, antenna up, reading out a severe thunderstorm watch for the whole county. The storm we'd been tracking for days. Finally arriving. The brass key was in my coat pocket, wrapped in his pencil note. I'd thought about what had opened the entire 10 days and gotten nowhere. A safe? A locker? A drawer in some office that had been his all along? I parked outside Margaret Ellison's low brick building as the first fat drops hit the windshield. My parents' Buick was already there. So was Dale's truck, the one he couldn't afford. I sat for a second with my hand on the radio's warm plastic case. "Whatever's in there," I told it. Like an idiot. Like a grieving idiot. We did our part. Then I turned it off, and the cab went quiet, and I picked up the key and the note, and went inside to learn what my grandfather had spent his last clear afternoon putting into writing. The waiting room smelled like rain and toner. My mother sat with her ankles crossed and her chin up, already wearing the face of a woman about to be vindicated. Dale bounced his knee. My father sat slightly apart, staring at the carpet, and when I came in, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between dread and apology, and then looked away. While we waited to be called in, my mother couldn't help herself. She never could. She leaned over to my father and said, "Just loud enough for the room." "Well, there's not much to read, is there?" The man gave it all away. To us. She said us like a small flag planted on a hill. Dale snorted softly. Probably the truck and that junk radio, he said, and glanced at me, because he'd seen me carry it in. Let me tell you what they believed, walking into that room, because it matters for what happened. They believed the 1.2 million had been the whole of Harold Anderson. They believed they already had the money, free and clear, the buyout complete. They believed today was a formality. A reading of a short will that left a dead frugal rancher's odds and ends to whoever wanted them, and that the only open question was whether I'd try to grab the mug and the radio for sentiment. They had no idea. None of them. They'd spent 30 years standing on top of something and calling it dirt. The inner door opened and Margaret Ellison stood there in her navy suit with the leather folder. She looked at all of us, one by one, and her gaze stopped on me last. Harold updated everything 8 weeks ago, she said. The whole room went still. 8 weeks. My mother's smile flickered. 8 weeks ago, put it after the porch, after the rain, after he'd moved into my 800 square feet and started sketching sensors and asking who keeps things in writing, updated everything. Margaret stepped back and held the door. Please, she said. He asked that I read it with all of you present. He was very clear about that. We filed in. The rain hit the windows hard. The conference room was small. A long table, 8 chairs, a window streaming with rain, a metal credenza against the far wall. My Aunt Carol and one of the cousins had come too, as witnesses Margaret had apparently asked for. We sat. My mother and father on one side, Dale beside them, me across, the relatives at the foot. Margaret took the head of the table and set down the leather folder, and beside it, a second thing. A long gray metal file cabinet drawer, the lockbox kind, that she'd lifted up onto the credenza. It had a small keyhole. I felt the brass key in my pocket like it had gotten heavier. Before I read the document, Margaret said, "Your grandfather left an instruction." She slid a folded note across to me. I opened it. His pencil. "Faye," it said. "Open it when she asks. The key is yours." So I stood, and I walked to the credenza, and with every eye in that room on me, I took out the brass key on its worn leather cord and fit it into the lock. It turned like it had been waiting 51 years. Inside the drawer was a single accordion file, thick, labeled in his blocky hand, "The Land." I carried it to the table and set it in front of Margaret. My mother's voice came out thin. "What is that?" Margaret opened the file, put on her reading glasses, and looked around the table over the top of them. "This," she said, "is what Harold Anderson actually owned." And the temperature in that room changed before she'd read a single number. Margaret read it plainly, no drama, which made it worse for them. In 1979, she said, Harold Anderson severed the mineral estate from the surface of his ranch and signed a mineral lease that the rest of the county thought was worthless. It was not worthless. For 46 years, those minerals had produced, slow at first, then steadily. Then, after the new wells came in across the basin, substantially. Harold had never spent a dollar of it. He'd let it accumulate in accounts and conservative holdings he managed himself, alone, telling no one, patching his boots, rolling his windows down. When he sold the surface of the ranch last year, Margaret said, he sold only the dirt. He kept what was underneath. She turned the statement around so the table could see the bottom line. The mineral estate and its accumulated proceeds were valued, as of 8 weeks ago, at just over $20 million. $20 million. The number sat in the middle of the table like a stone dropped through a window. Dale made a sound like he'd been hit. My mother said, "That's impossible," in a voice that had lost all its certainty. Carol's hand went to her mouth. And my father didn't look at the statement at all. He was looking at the accordion file, at the words, "The Land," in his own father's pencil, and his face had gone gray. The land was never just dirt. I heard it in my grandfather's voice as clear as if the radio in the truck had carried it in. He'd told me twice. He'd told me at the empty fence and again, the night the prototype worked. and both times I'd half listened, busy losing at my own life. My mother recovered first, the way predators do. "Fine," she said, gripping the table edge. "Fine. But we have the 1.2 million. That's settled. That was his gift to Roy." Margaret let her finish. Then she drew a single page from the file and laid it flat. "About that," she said, "Harold documented the transfer of the $1.2 million in this estate plan. He recorded it not as a gift, and not as payment for care, because no caregiver agreement was ever signed. He recorded it as an advance against Roy's share of the estate. An advance." My mother didn't understand the word yet. I watched it land on her in stages. Margaret made it simple. "It means," she said, "the 1.2 million has already been counted. It comes off the top of what Roy was to receive. There is no separate gift. And under the terms Harold signed 8 weeks ago, after deducting that advance, the remainder allocated to Roy Anderson is..." She ran her finger down the page. "This amount." She turned it around. The number under Roy's name was small. Smaller than the truck Dale couldn't afford. Margaret looked up, and she read one line from the document in my grandfather's own words, because he'd asked her to read it exactly. "A cleared check is not the same as a kept promise." I heard my mother's own voice come back at her across 8 months and a grave. "We took care of him. The check cleared." And I watched it break against that single sentence. She'd built her whole defense on a receipt. And my grandfather, from inside a folder labeled in pencil, had just informed the room that he'd never accepted the receipt as payment at all. Then Margaret came to me, and I want to be honest about what I felt, which was almost nothing. A high, clean ringing, like after a loud noise. "The residue of the estate," she read, "after the advance to Roy and modest bequests to others, including a fund Harold directed be established, passes in trust to his granddaughter, Faye Anderson." She named the figure. I didn't hold on to it. I was holding on to the edge of the table and the brass key, still warm from my hand. Margaret set down the statement and picked up the cream envelope I had found and never opened, 11 days before I ever met her. "He asked me to read this to you, all of you, at the end," she said. She unfolded the letter. It was short. He'd never wasted a word in his life. "To the ones who got the check," he wrote, "I hope it spends well. I gave it to you on purpose. I wanted to see what a man does when he thinks the money is already his, and the old man is just wait. Now I know. To Faye. You didn't open the envelope. I watched you put it back. You never asked what was in it for you. Not once. Not on the worst night. And that is the only reading of a person I have ever trusted. The land was never just dirt, kid. Neither were you. Take care of it like you took care of me." I didn't cry in that room. I'd promised myself I wouldn't do the other thing in front of them, and I kept the promise the way I'd kept the other one. But I put my hand flat on the accordion file, on the word land in his pencil, and I left it there. That was when my mother detonated. She came up out of the chair with both hands on the table. "She manipulated him," she said, her voice climbing. "A sick, confused old man 8 weeks before he died. She got in his ear. She turned him. This is undue influence, and I will contest every word of it." Margaret didn't blink. "The video record of Harold's capacity assessment is in the file," she said. 2 physicians. He was found fully competent. You're welcome to contest it." My mother turned on me instead. "After everything I gave up for this family," she said, 30 years, and you steal it out from under us with a soldering iron and a sob story." Her face was wet now, but it wasn't grief. It was rage wearing grief's clothes, and everyone in that room could finally see the difference. Dale had his head in his hands, doing the math on a number that wasn't coming. Carol had gone very still and was looking at my mother like she was seeing her clearly for the first time in 30 years. And my father, Roy made a sound, a small, cracked sound. He was staring at the letter in Margaret's hand, and his eyes were red and brimming, and his mouth moved. And what came out was one word. Dad. Just that. For 1 second I thought he might stand up. Might say the true thing. might break the right way. He looked at me. I looked back. And then my mother said Roy, sharp as a slap, and my father closed his mouth and lowered his eyes to the carpet and stayed exactly where he'd been for 30 years. Take care of me. He only ever asked one thing, of one person, and it wasn't the one with the check. I stood up. Not because I had a speech, I didn't. I stood because I was done sitting, and because the calmest thing in that loud room was me, and I wanted to keep it that way. My mother was still talking. Something about lawyers, something about how this wasn't over. I waited until she ran down. Then I said the only thing I had. I'm not going to fight you, I told her. I'm not going to contest or argue or post anything or call the cousins. Grandpa already said everything in writing. I'm just going to do what he asked. She stared at me, waiting for the attack that would let her be the victim. I didn't give it to her. You had a contract you never signed? I said. I had a man I never sent back. That's the whole difference. It's the only difference there ever was. I picked up the accordion file and the key, and I nodded to Margaret, who nodded back. At the door I stopped, because there was one more true thing, and it cost me nothing. He washed his own mug the night he died, I said, to the room, to my father most of all. So you wouldn't have to. Then I walked out into the hall, and behind me I heard my mother's voice rise again and break against the silence of everyone who used to believe her, and I kept walking, out past the toner smell, into the rain. Here's what the money did and didn't do, because catharsis is cheap and consequences are real. My parents kept their $1.2 million. It was already spent down a fair amount. A new Buick, a kitchen remodel, the down payment on Dale's failed flip. But the advance meant there was nothing more coming, and the $20 million they'd assumed was theirs by blood had never existed in their hands at all. They didn't contest. Margaret made a quiet call about the capacity assessments and the second physician, and the fight went out of it before it started. Dale had to face his own debt without a windfall to bail him out. Last I heard, he was selling the truck. The cousins who'd nodded along at the funeral got quiet. Aunt Carol called me a month later, and the first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, Faye." I believed her because it was easier. The version of my mother that had run our family for 30 years, devoted, deprived, devastated, didn't survive that conference room. People had watched her stand over the word land in her dead father's hand and call her own daughter a thief. You can't take that back with charcoal gray and sunglasses. She'd said, on a porch in the rain, he's not our problem anymore. She was right in the end, just not